Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome. I'm Peter Knox. I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities at Case Western Reserve University. The Baker Nord Center coordinates the annual Cleveland Humanities Festival in partnership with more than 30 institutions of education and culture around the city of Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. This year, our theme is nature. And it is a particular pleasure to be at an event like this, which really exemplifies everything that our festival is about. Collaboration with our friends and neighbors on important topics that matter to all of us, to bring in distinguished visitors who can stimulate conversations across the disciplines and around the city. So to partner with the Cleveland Museum of Art and with the program in Medicine, Society, and Culture really exemplifies what we are doing. I'm going to turn the podium over now to Professor Eileen Anderson-Fye, who is my colleague at the university, who founded the program in Medicine, Society, and Culture, and she will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter, and the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities. There is no better collaborator. Thank you also to the Department of Bioethics and the School of Medicine, who see well-being as a broad, out-of-the-box topic, and of course to the Cleveland Museum of Art for hosting us. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Robert Petty, Senior Director of Education for Yellowstone Forever. So what is an MFA painter doing leading one of the nation's foremost conservation education institutes? As in the talk to follow, for Robert, art, nature, life, it's all integrated. Robert used his fine arts skills as a scientific illustrator for the University of Montana. He has also painted some of Audubon, the National Audubon Society's most beautiful birds, including a poster that was commissioned when he was selected as the featured artist for International Migratory Bird Day in 2010. I have had the pleasure to see some of his original paintings, and they have taken my breath in their beauty. So while he is speaking of other painters, he himself is quite accomplished. Robert grew up in the woods with a family who knew and loved the wild. He comes by his conservation honestly. His father was a poet ecologist, so he grew up with the seamless integration of art and nature. After graduating from Washington University, St. Louis, with his Bachelor's of Fine Arts and Communications, he went to teach art. He then attended the University of Montana and earned an MFA in painting. Beginning his own successful natural history center in Montana, and then joining the Nature Conservancy, Robert fused art and conservation. In 1997, he joined Audubon in multiple roles until he was the director of bird-friendly communities, where he worked all over the United States, including Northeast Ohio, on bird-friendly programming and policy. Over 2 years ago, he joined Yellowstone Forever, running the educational initiatives in Yellowstone National Park. I met Robert in Shrewsbury, England, along with Dr. Marco Licio here tonight, who is the visionary and compassionate chair of the Department of Bioethics. Mark and I are the Case Western Reserve University representatives to the Darwin International Institute for the Study of Compassion. Anyone who spends more than 60 seconds with Robert will see why he was invited and became the North American institutional representative to this international institute. Robert, Mark, and I dreamed up a new class to be taught in Yellowstone National Park, and unlike any other in the U.S., called Conservation, Compassion, and Awe in Yellowstone National Park, Environmental Ethics and Human Health. We are teaching that class in May, and any students present here are welcome to enroll. And in the meantime, we have gained a wonderful partner and collaborator. We also have two things that Yellowstone does not: a world-class university and museum. Please help me welcome Robert.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Mark, for your role in making it possible for me to be here. Peter Knox and the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and Maggie Kaminsky for all your work to make it possible for me to be here as well. It's truly an honor to be here in Cleveland. I'm afraid the last time I was here was like 1978. I was a good year. Yes, it was a good year. I was shopping for colleges as a high school student. I came to check out the Cleveland Institute of Art. I didn't end up going there, but it's nice to be back. I also want to honor or acknowledge the great work of Peter Herrick, who is the Director Emeritus and Senior Scholar at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. His scholarship and research and expertise into the art of the American West is central to a lot of the work that I will present here today. It's really refreshing to step back into spring. Back in Montana where I live, or actually I live in Yellowstone National Park, which is a ridiculous thing to say, but we still have like 4 to 6 feet of snow. So to step back here is like stepping into spring, and later this week I'll go back to winter. I've had the added privilege, beyond just living in the park, of living in Montana for over 30 years, but to devote one's life to conservation and to be able to work on behalf of the preservation of such places where there are grizzly bears and wolves and golden eagles and just majestic beauty all around. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to be a part of something that meaningful. So I feel very honored to be there and share that with you today. But this Ohio landscape is actually very familiar to me. I grew up in Indiana, so I'm sort of a boy of the Midwest deciduous forest, the soft landscape of sort of limestone and deciduous trees. But when I was young, about 11 years old, my family took a vacation to the west, and we crossed the Great Plains, and I had this vision of the Rocky Mountains as being, well, my imagination fell short. They were far greater than I actually imagined, but for a boy of 11, it was spectacular, and actually laying eyes on the Rocky Mountains and on Yellowstone National Park, it just took my breath away. It transformed my life. Later, I went to go to graduate school there in Montana. I intended to stay about 2 years. I stayed 33 so far. Life has a way of sort of unfolding around you. But like so many millions of people who come to Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountains and the Wild West, it can change your life. And it can change your life in a way that inspires you to do things, to work on behalf of such places. So while millions of people come to Yellowstone every year, our hope through our education programs is that experience will not just change them, but will inspire them through their experiences to continue to work on behalf of places locally, whether it's your own backyard or your local city park or the Cuyahoga National Park right here in Ohio. While I intended to create a life around art, I wound up in this unforeseen world of conservation. It was unpredicted to me, but it's been a very joyful and meaningful experience. And being at Yellowstone is a way for me to kind of synthesize a lot of the interests that I have in this world of art and conservation. Through this presentation, I'm going to share several stories. One is the central story of the creation of Yellowstone National Park itself. And the other is going to be the story of John James Audubon, And finally, I'm going to talk about Albert Bierstadt and his role in conservation as well. The first story I will tell you about is Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is an incredible place. It's a land of majestic hot springs like Grand Prismatic, where thermophilic bacteria create an amazing palette of colors in and of themselves. It's a land of astonishing beauty. It's a place where hot springs like Mammoth Hot Springs continually deposit travertine and create these incredible ghostly sculptural forms, terraces that just seeing them is inspiring in itself. Yellowstone is home to more than 10,000 thermal features, including 500 active geysers, which is over half of the world's geysers, all in one small place. It's a place where great pools of mud boil up like some primordial soup. And it's a land where sort of life's beginnings feel so present. There's actually some research going on that is looking at the microbial evolution of bacteria in these hot springs that is funded by NASA to explore the possible beginnings of life. It's also just a tremendously majestic landscape, incredible beauty, and every day, every turn around the park is a little bit different. Yellowstone is a region that had been known for thousands of years by Native Americans, but it was essentially unknown to European Americans. The Lewis and Clark expedition, who came through Montana exploring the Louisiana Purchase, they came close, but they just missed it. Clark, on his return part of it, Lewis and Clark split up, and when Clark was coming close to Yellowstone, he didn't quite explore the headwaters of Yellowstone River, and so everything that is inside the park was basically made up in that map. He didn't track it to the source. One member of Lewis and Clark's group, John Colter, came back the following year. He was interested in establishing trade with the Crow Indians, and he is considered to be the first European American to actually see the wonders of Yellowstone. And he described a landscape that seemed so outrageous that few people gave it any credence at all. They ended up sort of jokingly referring to it as Colter's Hell. Later in the 1800s, the fur trapper era from the 1820s and 1830s, a man named Jim Bridger knew this area well. And he described similarly wild and exotic places, mud pots and steaming pools. But he was also a storyteller, and he embellished things a little bit. And so his tall tales, in some respects, were equally unbelievable. So the truth of the place was actually not well believed. But the folks in the East began to be interested in this place and wondered what it was really all about. We didn't know at the time whether it was truth or whether it was fiction, whether it was just fanciful tales or not. So for decades after Lewis and Clark came through, it was essentially tall tales or stories. In 1870, a group of 9 civilians headed by Henry Washburn departed from Helena to go explore the place. But they weren't really telling everybody what they were looking for, because they were considered, they thought they would be considered liars about exploring this place. But they were among the first to actually document what was there. This Washburn expedition is considered to be the first, they're considered to be the discoverers of Yellowstone. But of course now we know the cultural arrogance of discovering a place that's been inhabited for thousands of years by people. But they were the first to name Old Faithful, and that name has stuck. It's not necessarily the most reliable geyser, but it is one that has captured the imagination of people to this day. They also described those boiling mud pots that Bridger had described and Colter had talked about. They saw the expansive Yellowstone Lake, which is the largest alpine lake above 7,000 feet in elevation in the entire country. And they saw firsthand the intense colors that are created by the thermophilic bacteria in these hot springs. Along with that expedition were two amateur artists, one named Walter Trumbull, who was the son of a U.S. senator, and a private in the Army who joined the expedition, Charles Moore. And they made what are considered to be the first drawings of Yellowstone. Here is their two depictions of the upper falls of the Yellowstone River. Nathaniel Langford documented that trip, and he wrote it up as a story and submitted it to Scribner's magazine, Scribner's Monthly, which was eager to publish and tell the story of this place that has so captured the imagination of folks in the East. But the editors needed renderings that were more sophisticated than Trumbull or Moore had created. So they turned to a local Philadelphia artist, a man named Thomas Moran, and they gave those crude renderings to Moran, who created these much more sophisticated images that illustrated that monthly magazine. So Thomas Moran actually illustrated Yellowstone before he had ever been there. That was in 1870. In 1871, Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden put together an expedition that was the first officially funded expedition by the U.S. government. Hayden had an official artist, a man named Henry Woods Elliott, whose drawings were not quite as sophisticated as Moran's, and a man named Jay Cook, who was a financier. He financed a lot of the Union Army of the Civil War, and he was working for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and he recognized that he needed some sophisticated images to be able to promote this area for the railroad. He turned to two artists, Albert Bierstadt, who was probably the most celebrated landscape painter of the era, and Thomas Moran, who was far less known at the time. Bierstadt had been to Yosemite. This is a painting of Yosemite Valley that's right here in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Bierstadt was so well known and so famous, and he was making a lot of money, frankly, from his Yosemite images, that he essentially turned down the invitation to join the Yellowstone expedition. But Thomas Moran did not. This is an image that Moran had painted of Catawissa in Pennsylvania, and it shows you a little bit about the sophistication of Moran's art. But Moran saw this opportunity and signed up, not as the official artist, but as an invited artist by Jay Cook. Moran was born in Bolton, Lancashire, England in 1837. His family moved to Baltimore and they settled in the Philadelphia area. Moran, interestingly, while he had spent a lot of time out painting, he'd never actually spent time sleeping out in the wilds, and he documented that a little bit later in his journals of the trip. But he joined the photographer William Henry Jackson, who was a veteran of the Civil War. He returned after the Civil War to Vermont, and apparently had he was engaged to be married to a young woman who had apparently broken his heart. And so he bolted out of Vermont and went as far west as he could possibly go to get away from the broken heart. So he ended up west of Omaha and took up the new medium of photography. The two of them, Moran and Jackson, became fast friends, and they spent this time together exploring Yellowstone. And as I mentioned before, Moran kept a journal that documented the whole experience. This journal is a part of the official National Archives, which is located just outside Yellowstone. And when you come to Yellowstone, which I'm sure every one of you will, you need to go to the Heritage Research Center, which holds a lot of these materials from that expedition. When they finally got to Yellowstone, William Henry Jackson began documenting some of these features that had been so well described before but never actually photographed. This is an image of Thomas Moran at Mammoth Hot Springs. Photography wasn't easy back then. I'm guessing this might be the world's first selfie taking in Yellowstone. The camera equipment itself weighed over 100 pounds, and they had to have glass plates that were susceptible to breaking, and it took over an hour to set up and take a photograph and process the image. But Moran and Jackson worked together. They never actually took exactly the same, or rendered the exact same images, but they did document similar, the same features as they explored the park. The relatively new medium of photography couldn't lie back then. People, when they saw a photograph, they considered it to be truth. And so this was a way to finally document what was actually there. But Moran was an amazing colorist, and he was able to capture in paint the incredible deep saturated hues of this landscape. As I mentioned before, the original quick sketches that he did on that expedition are all housed at the Heritage Research Center just outside of Gardner, Montana, near the north entrance to the park. They worked together. As I mentioned before, they were close friends, and they stayed friends throughout their lives. And at the end of that expedition, Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden submitted his official report, and it was his report that actually documented the scientific truth of what was there, or the scientific underpinnings of what was actually there. And it was William Henry Jackson's photography that actually proved to the world that this place actually existed. But it was Thomas Moran's paintings that captured the majesty in such a way that Congress created an act that was submitted to Congress in December of 1871, and the majesty of the place as conveyed through Moran's paintings were what inspired Congress to officially create the world's first national park. And so on March 1st of 1872, Ulysses Grant signed the act that created Yellowstone National Park. And it's an example of where art and photography both work together to inspire what could be an incredibly significant moment in time, because this was the world's first collective national park, and that paved the way for all of the other national parks, both in this country and in other places. Moran's reputation quickly grew. He started signing his name T.Y.M., Thomas Yellowstone Moran, and this was essentially what made his career. Throughout that year following the expedition, he created this painting of the upper or the lower falls of the Yellowstone. and unveiled it just a few weeks after the creation of the park in 1872. And this painting became the first painting ever acquired by the U.S. government, and it is now in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and it's worth the trip there just to see this painting. I want to step back about a century to another artist, John James Audubon. He was born Jean-Jacques Rabin to a French father and who was a sugarcane plantation owner, and one of his mistresses in what is now Haiti. Unfortunately, his mother died shortly after he was born, and his father took him back to France, where he grew up and was essentially adopted by his mother. Audubon is known, it's really, his name is synonymous with birds. He's known for these incredible paintings of the birds of North America. The Audubon Society, that I'm sure you're all familiar with, is well known for incredible photography, and an award-winning magazine that many of you have received and collected over the years, I'm sure. Audubon Society is also known for conservation. This is an image of my friend Steve Kress, who has developed the technique for restoring bird populations of seabirds along the coast. He pretty much single-handedly brought puffins back to the coast of Maine. The Audubon Society is also known for the local Audubon chapters, people who are just dying to get one last life bird on their life list. And it's also known for a network of nature centers. When I worked for Audubon, one of the jobs that I had was supporting our network of nature centers throughout the country. And these are places that are dedicated both to conservation and to education, introducing youth to the world of birds. When I was working for Audubon, one of our Audubon centers was getting ready to publish a big multi-page promotional piece, and at the center of that promotional piece was this quote. And I just happened to be given this magazine or this publication to proof before it was printed. And when I saw this, I just stopped short and I said, there is no way John James Audubon ever said that. A true conservationist is a man who knows that the world is not given by his fathers but borrowed from his children. I'm always a little wary of quotes that sound like they belong at the end of an email signature or on a refrigerator magnet. The bottom line is he did not say this, but I did my research and I looked for it, and sure enough, I Googled it. There it is, all over the internet. I've even seen it etched in granite in front of nature centers. But the bottom line, he didn't say it. It came from an author, John Madsen, who was a conservation writer in the 1960s and 70s, and I haven't found it exactly, but I think Madsen was a contributor to Audubon magazine, and I think this was written in an Audubon magazine, and it was then somehow attributed to John James Audubon. But it's a fascinating quote, and the truth is that Audubon, the organization, is a conservation organization. So the question is, how did the conservation actually come into being through the Audubon Society? Well, the story is actually more interesting to me than inspired directly through Audubon. Audubon as a boy was just, he wasn't a great student. He spent a lot of time out in the woods just fascinated by birds. And he spent a lot of time just drawing birds, exploring the wilds. He was one of those kids who would come back with frogs in his pocket and feathers in his head and just always exploring nature. He moved to the United States from France in, I believe it was 1809, to a home that his father had purchased in Mill Grove, Pennsylvania. And he started his life in the United States here at Mill Grove, which is actually now an Audubon Center run by the National Audubon Society. But he didn't stay there long, although he did meet his wife there, Lucy Bakewell Audubon, who was the daughter of a neighbor. But he was always out just documenting birds, writing down all the birds that he saw, and he was fascinated by just the world of birds. He developed a painting technique where he would take birds that he had shot and wire them up and put them in lifelike poses. But he was also a scientist. He was one of the very first to actually use bird banding to document the movement of birds. He would tie string or different colored pieces of yarn to birds that he had captured to begin to understand about their movements. Over time, his drawings got more sophisticated. He began to include the habitat features. His most contemporary competitor was a man named Alexander Wilson. This is an image of Wilson's. And Wilson's drawings of birds feel very stiff. They look like museum specimens, which is probably what they were. But Audubon captured birds in a way that had never been captured before. Just incredible, beautiful renderings of birds. His magnus opus was the Birds of America, this giant book that was, he wanted to publish them life-size, and this was an incredible publication. This is one of the world's most valuable books now. One of them sold, I believe it was 2010, for over $11 million. In his renderings, he captured the bird behavior, he captured the habitat. He was criticized for maybe over-dramatizing some of the images, but they were animated in a way that had never been done before. But he was not a conservationist. He shot every bird that he painted. But I don't mean that critically necessarily, because there weren't cameras back then. There weren't, high-end Swarovski binoculars back then, so he couldn't. To see them, he had to shoot them and bring them in close. But he did sort of enjoy the killing, I think. One of his assistants was quoted as saying, "I've never met a man with such a lust for killing." And he himself considered it sort of a light day if he had only shot less than 100 birds that day. And he killed many species that are now considered extinct, like the ivory-billed woodpecker, the Carolina parakeet. I mentioned before that quote just didn't sound like Audubon either. If you're familiar with Audubon's writing, it just doesn't have the same flavor. This is a quote of what he wrote about the roseate spoonbill. "I have considered these birds as tough to kill," and he states that their flesh is oily and of poor eating. But I don't want to diminish his significant role in conservation. One of the first steps to understanding what we need to conserve is understanding what we have to lose. And Audubon, more than any other person of the 19th century, documented the world of birds for us. But the story of how the Audubon Society came to get started is actually more interesting to me. This is Audubon's home on the Upper West Side of New York City. This is where he lived out his remaining years. He died in 1851. This is around 156th Street. If you've ever been to New York City, it doesn't look like this much anymore. But in 1849, 2 years before Audubon died, this man on the left, a man named George Bird Grinnell, was born in Brooklyn. And when Grinnell was a boy of 8 years old, his family moved to the area around Audubon's home. It was called Audubon Park. And he became a neighbor and a playmate to Audubon's grandchildren. And Lucy, his widow, Audubon's widow, had a school for her grandchildren, and she invited the neighborhood kids to come in to play or to learn. And so he became familiar with birds. He wandered through the house that was Audubon's and spent a lot of his time experiencing the world of Audubon's paintings just by being in that home. And he learned about birds through Lucy Audubon, and he grew up knowing birds through Audubon's art. And so it's an example of how art can inspire children to be concerned or fascinated by this world of birds. As an adult, George Bird Grinnell became concerned about the decline of bird populations because of the fashion of the time, the Victorian fashion of women wearing feathered hats. At the time, the millinery trade or the feather trade was so significant that they began to document exactly what was happening to the decline of birds. And just as an example, in 1892, one order of feathers for a hat maker in Europe, in London, included over 6,000 birds of paradise, 40,000 hummingbirds, 360,000 various birds of East Indian origin. And in 1902, at one auction in London, there was one lot that was sold of heron feathers, and the heron, that one lot represented over 250,000 great blue herons. And they were of course shot when their plumage was at their finest, which was during breeding season. So these birds were killed, and so that figure doesn't represent the total impact, because the young that were being fed by those adults, of course, didn't survive. So the millinery trade was huge. And so George Bird Grinnell founded the Audubon Society of New York, and he named it after John James Audubon because of his experiences as a kid being in the midst of Audubon's art. So another wonderful example of how art can inspire. I want to return now to Albert Bierstadt. Again, he is most well known for these majestic landscape paintings, and I'm eager to go into the collections here and see this painting of Yosemite Valley. But I want to talk a little bit about some of his lesser known art. He was fascinated by the American bison, and he saw the bison as sort of a symbol of the West. And in his mind, he was a witness during this incredible era from about 1850 through the 1890s that saw the incredible transformation of that Western landscape that included the decline of bison and the extermination of many Native American tribes. To understand that transformation, you really have to know about the bison itself. The American bison is now, as of 2016, our national mammal. And if you want to see bison, Yellowstone is the place to see them. But bison originally were almost throughout the entire North American continent. I've put a little red dot here on the map for Cleveland. Bison extended as far east as Pennsylvania, Ohio and Pennsylvania. They extended as far south as northern Mexico, as far west as Oregon, and as far north as the Northwest Territories of Canada. But by 1802, the bison were gone from Ohio. By 1825, they were restricted to the Great Plains. By the 1850s, by the 1825, they were restricted west of the Mississippi, and by the 1850s, they were restricted to parts of the Great Plains. a great impact on the bison populations, which had numbered, estimated between 30 and 60 million bison on the North American continent. Their population were greatly impacted by the advent of the railroad. Bierstadt witnessed this change, and he did a series of paintings focused on the bison. This one's called the Buffalo Trail. It was painted in 1867, and it's in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. It's a fairly hopeful scene. It shows the bison trailing off into the distance. In 1869, he painted this image called the Impending Storm. It's a little more ominous. The shape of the trees, the storm clouds brewing. It's the impending storm. The Transcontinental Railroad came through in 1869, the same year that painting was created. And the spike at Promontory Point, Utah, the golden spike which connected the east and west segments of the Transcontinental Railroad, I often think of as the last nail in the coffin of the American bison. In 1870, over 2 million bison were killed that year alone in the southern plains. Germany at the time had developed a process of tanning that made it possible to tan hides on a very large commercial scale. By 1871, one firm in St. Louis had sold and traded over 250,000 buffalo hides, again, for fashion. The men of the day, of course, had to wear the latest fashion, which was buffalo hides. The bones as well were used. They were used for fertilizer and were sold for between $2.50 to $15 per ton. By 1876, the estimated 3 to 4 million bison of the southern plains were completely gone. Bierstadt painted this painting just called Western Kansas, which was sort of the third in the trilogy of that series. This was in 1875, 6 years after the impending storm. And at this point, you look at this painting, and the bison are almost merging with the landscape. The ones behind are almost indiscernible from the bank of the river there. And so this is kind of almost a twilight image of what's happened to the bison. By 1884, there were only an estimated 325 wild bison left in the world, and 25 of those were holed up in Yellowstone National Park. This is an image of the Lamar Valley in the northern range of Yellowstone. This is where those bison, those relic bison populations were. And it is believed that this landscape was the scene for one of Bierstadt's probably last great paintings. If you look back, toggle back and forth between the two, you can almost see that same landscape as the setting for this painting. If you look at this painting, it's really kind of an allegory. It's a depiction of the end of an era, and it's not just the end of the bison, but it's a picture of the end of the Native American Indian as well. You see the bones of the bison strewn about. You also, it's a little hard to see, but among those dead bison in the foreground, there's a dead Indian as well. So it's really kind of documenting what he saw as really the end of the American West. The 325 remaining wild bison were gone by 1894. And at this point, there were only, of those 25, the population dropped to what we believe was a low of 23 individual wild bison from 30 to 60 million down to 23 remaining individuals. This was, the Army had set up a post in Yellowstone to try and catch the poachers, but they had no legal authority to really punish them, which seemed a little odd. But even after the park was created in 1872, poachers faced few deterrents from taking wildlife in the park. I want to talk a little bit about the creation of the Boone and Crockett Club, which, if you're familiar with the Boone and Crockett Club, it's a hunting organization, but it was founded in 1888 by Teddy Roosevelt, who wasn't president yet. And it was also founded by our friend George Bird Grinnell, who met in Roosevelt's place in Manhattan to form the Boone and Crockett Club. And in that first meeting of approximately a dozen individuals was Albert Bierstadt. So these three men were part of an organization that was founded in 1888. It was a hunting club, but it was dedicated to conservation. And among the first orders of business was to focus on Yellowstone National Park, expanding it, protecting it, and making it illegal to kill bison in the park. They worked to pass legislation which basically became the National Park Protection Act of 1894. And it was that act that really marked the beginning of Yellowstone as a movement of conservation. In 1872, when it was created, the park was created as a concept, but it wasn't dedicated to conservation until 1894. And in the early 1900s, in the Lamar Valley, where those bison were, they established the Lamar Buffalo Ranch, which was dedicated to trying to bring the bison back. The park purchased about 21 bison from herds that were known to be genetically pure, both from Montana and from Texas, and they started a breeding program. This was way before the Endangered Species Act, of course, but this legislation and then what happened in Yellowstone was an effort to protect a species to go from becoming extinct, and they were really on the brink of extinction at that point. At Lamar, they started a breeding program, and over time, those 21 bison grew. By 1954, the bison population had recovered to about 14 to 1,500. And at that point, they stopped the supplemental feeding program and started releasing bison back into the park. And today in Yellowstone, we have a healthy population of between 4,000 and 5,000 bison. And again, when you come to Yellowstone, I guarantee you will see bison. The Lamar Buffalo Ranch was no longer needed as a facility for bison, and in 1976 it was converted to the Yellowstone Institute, where a lot of our education programs are based. The Lamar Valley is often referred to as the Yosemite, or the Serengeti of North America, because it's this great, wide, expansive valley where you can see great herds of bison and elk and now wolves throughout the area. And we owe this experience in part to the art and the activism of Albert Bierstadt. The legacy of art continues in Yellowstone. Last year we transformed one of the old Haynes photo shops in the park at Old Faithful into the Yellowstone Art and Photography Center, where we now have over 100,000 visitors each year experiencing art in the park. And last fall we started the first ever Yellowstone Plein Air Invitational for a Plein Air Invitational Art Festival, where the legacy of art continues. 15 artists were invited to the 3-day event celebrating the painting in the park and carrying on the tradition of the first plein air painter in the park, Thomas Moran, who captured the majesty of Yellowstone. So whether it is artist as scientist and chronicler of birds, or whether it's the artist as witness and agent to the change, or whether it's art as a source of inspiration and collective action, art has and continues to have the power to compel and motivate the human spirit towards the essential noble act, in my mind anyway, of conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. We have a few minutes if anyone has questions. Out of the way.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. If I may ask either approximate or if you know how many paintings did Albert Bierstadt do?
Oh, goodness. I really don't know. Many landscape paintings, not nearly as many of the Bison, but I really couldn't say what his body of work is. Yes?
The gentleman who lived next to Audubon, was Bird his real middle name?
It was his given name. That's one of the interesting coincidences of history. I don't know whether middle names can inspire people, but that is a curious coincidence. Yes?
I think that Bierstadt was an ancestor of one of the directors of this museum, Evan Hopkins Turner.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you have collaborated with Clevelander, who is important in terms of the wolf population in the park, Doug Smith.
We work closely with Doug Smith. Yes, Doug.
So I look forward to some art that would include some of the wolves that he...
Is Doug from Cleveland?
Yes.
Oh, fascinating. I didn't know that. I'll have to let him know that I was in his hometown. We work very closely with Doug on the wolf program. He's a remarkable man. Yes, sir.
This is beautiful. You gave this as a study in history of how this art affected attitudes towards Yellowstone in the ways that you described so well. Where are we today? What is art doing to help us teach the value of these kinds of things in a contemporary age, which has quite different values and attitudes towards nature?
That's a very good question. It is a very different age. It's an age where images are bombarding us every single day, every single second through our smartphones and other media. And it's harder today to be able to capture the attention of people because of just the sheer volume of imagery that's coming out. You go think back to when Bierstadt was painting or Moran was painting, those images and Audubon's work too were the only way we had to really see some places or view and be inspired by places, because photography didn't exist. The painting was the medium. But to answer your question, art, I have to believe, still has the power to compel, to inspire, and to motivate people to change. The art festival that we do in Yellowstone is one example of that. There are plein air festivals. Yellowstone's a little late to the game of plein air festivals. There are plein air festivals throughout other national parks that celebrate this work or this activity of painting out in the open and celebrating landscape. We are featuring an artist as a part of a master's series that we're doing this summer, a woman named Asher Jay, who is a graphic designer, communicator. She's also a designated National Geographic explorer, and she uses her design sensibilities to create campaigns that are dedicated to conservation action. So there are artists who are dedicating themselves, and I still believe that art has that power and will always have that power to motivate, but it is challenging.
This is sort of a conservation question. Are those Moran pictures watercolor?
Yes, the first paintings that he did were watercolor. The sketches that he did in the park were watercolor. The large images of the Grand Canyon are done in oil. He did those watercolor sketches on site at Yellowstone, and did a lot of drawings as well. Brought those back to his studio and created large, the more majestic paintings.
So just any speculation on how he achieved those colors as an artist yourself?
How he achieved those colors? Well, he was an amazing colorist. I mean, that was one of his great gifts as an artist. But when you come to Yellowstone, and I know you will, when you see these colors, again, it's the color of the landscape. He may have embellished it a little bit, but those colors are real. The colors, again, created by the thermophilic bacteria in these hot springs, it's vivid. That initial photograph that I showed you of the blue hot springs and the orange and yellow streams emanating from that hot springs, that's just a photograph. Just a photograph. It's an amazing photograph. Yes?
Are the grizzlies in a protected area of the park? And I also want to ask, do you live like in a log cabin or what?
To answer your first question, the grizzlies don't know where the boundaries of the park are.
You protect them from the people.
Oh, no. The grizzly population is recovering, and they've recently been proposed to be taken off the endangered species list. Their population is growing, is expanding. I don't live in a little log cabin, but I do live in a small government tract house in Lower Mammoth. It's a wonderful little place. My backyard is the park. I have to watch for bison when I open the front door of my house to make sure they're not sleeping on my yard. In the back.
Do you have a favorite season of the year?
Winter. I don't think you can fully understand Yellowstone if you haven't been there in the winter. The limitations of the cold and the snow really define that landscape. And it's also a time when you can experience it without as much sort of crush of humanity coming through it. If you can get into the interior through one of the snow coaches and ski around some of the thermal features, you experience it in a way you won't during the summer at all. Yes?
You showed that the Transcontinental Railway went up to the park. Are there any scenic railways that go through it so people who don't hike could drive?
There never were railroads that came through the park. The Northern Pacific Railroad came north of the park, and there was a spur that came down from Livingston down to the north entrance in Gardner and stopped right there at the north entrance where the famous Roosevelt Arch is located. So there weren't any railroads that actually came through the park. But it's been a while since I've taken Amtrak. I did take the High Line across the northern tier of states. And it's a great way to travel. Yes?
So getting back to the question about where we are today with art, I'm wondering what opposition Boone and Crockett encountered from the millinery trade, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Because in American Wolf, he talks about the folks who didn't like the fact that they named one of the wolves, and there was a movie made because it was kind of showing the beauty of just one species and kind of a biased. So was there opposition to what they were trying to do with the bison and Boone and Crockett?
I don't know. The Boone and Crockett Club remains a very strong advocate for conservation. And at the time, I'm sure there were, opposing political forces that wanted to, take it to the last extreme and make a profit off of the last bison. But But fortunately, and certainly with the millinery trade, the feather trade, there were opposing forces for sure.
We can maybe take one more question.
In the back?
So I'm in a Stages class about national parks, and I have a question about what would you like to see from the younger generation or impart on the younger generation about national parks?
Oh, great question. The youth are our future. I want young people to come to Yellowstone. I want you to experience, come take our class, but come and be inspired. Come and see these places firsthand and be inspired by them. Bring your family, bring your selfie phone, bring whatever you have and be inspired, and then take that inspiration out into whatever world you inhabit. Thank you.
And we need to conclude the program. Thank you so much.